Here is a fact that breaks the story you know. When Germany split in two, the half that turned communist was not the poor half. By one careful reconstruction, it started out slightly richer. 2 generations later, it produced barely a third of what the West did. Per person, same people, same language, same ruins, 2 rulebooks. So how does the richer half fall this far behind? Let's start in 1945. 1945. Germany is rubble. The cities are craters, the currency is nearly worthless, and the country that started the war has ceased to exist as a state. The victors carve it into occupation zones: American, British, French in the West, Soviet in the East. Within 4 years, those zones harden into 2 countries. And that split created something economists still study: one people, one language, one industrial tradition, suddenly running under 2 completely different sets of rules. Here's the detail that gets lost. The eastern half was not the backward half. Saxony and Thuringia were industrial heartland, machine tools, optics, chemicals. By one careful reconstruction, income per person in the territory that became East Germany was slightly higher than in the West before the war. Keep that number on the ledger. The story ahead makes no sense without it. Before either system could prove anything, their starting burdens had already split. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people, and it wanted payment. So it collected in kind. Whole factories in the eastern zone were unbolted, crated, and shipped east. Rail lines were torn up, down to the second track. Engineers and scientists were relocated. Estimates of the total burden vary, but historians agree the eastern zone paid the overwhelming share of Germany's reparations bill. The western zones got the opposite treatment. After a brief flirtation with deindustrializing Germany, the Allies reversed course. A functioning German economy was suddenly worth more to them than a punished one. So mark the first entry in our cause ledger, before politics, before planning. The East began the race, carrying the war on its back, and the West began it with the debt largely forgiven. That alone explains part of the gap. Part, not all. 1948, the Western zones. The old currency is so broken that cigarettes work better. Then, in one June weekend, everything changes. A new currency, the Deutsche Mark, replaces it. And the economics director, Ludwig Erhard, does something almost nobody expected. He abolishes most price controls practically overnight. The result became legend. Shelves that had been empty for years filled within weeks, not because goods suddenly existed, but because selling them legally suddenly made sense. Prices were allowed to be messengers again. Now, the answer you've probably heard is 2 words: Marshall Plan. American aid mattered. It bought imports. It rebuilt confidence. But at its peak, it came to roughly 2.5% of national income. It helped. It was not the engine. Most economic historians put the currency reform, the price liberalization, and the rules that followed at the center of the story. The famous explanation is the smaller one. 1949. The split becomes official. 2 states, 2 constitutions, 2 economic operating systems. The Federal Republic in the West runs what it calls a social market economy. Private ownership, open competition, prices set by markets, with a state that referees and provides a safety net. The German Democratic Republic in the East runs the Soviet model, state ownership of industry, a central plan that decides what gets produced in what quantity at what price. And the 2 economies plug into different worlds: the West into the trading system of Western Europe, coal, steel, and eventually the common market; the East into Cumcon, the Soviet bloc's closed exchange where trade often ran on barter logic. From here on, every difference between the halves is, at least in part, a measurement. The experiment nobody designed is running. The 1950s make the West look unstoppable. Real output grows at roughly 8% a year, a pace that doubles an economy inside a decade. They call it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, and refugees from the East supply it with skilled labor. The East grows too on paper, respectably, but the plan keeps meeting reality. In June 1953, the government raises work quotas, more output for the same pay. Construction workers in East Berlin put down their tools, and within days strikes spread to hundreds of towns. Soviet tanks ended the uprising. They did not solve the information problem behind it. A system with no prices had no honest way to know what its labor was worth. So it decreed a number, and the number was wrong. The gap between the halves is no longer a starting condition. It is compounding, year after year. Through the 50s, one border stays open: Berlin. Anyone can ride the S-Bahn from the eastern sector to the western one and simply not come back. And they do. Between 1949 and 1961, roughly 2.7 million people leave East Germany, from a population of about 18 million. Look at who leaves: the young, the trained. Doctors, engineers, teachers, the people a growing economy can least afford to lose. Every departure is a double entry in the ledger: a worker the East paid to educate, delivered free to the West's labor market. The planners can command a factory to produce. They cannot command a 25-year-old engineer to stay. By the summer of 1961, the mathematics of the drain are existential, and the answer the system reaches for tells you everything about which half of the experiment is losing. August 13th, 1961. Overnight, barbed wire goes up across Berlin. Concrete follows. The official name is the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart. The economic function is simpler. It is a wall to keep the workforce in. Pause on what that means. Prices are one kind of signal. Exit is another. When people can leave, every departure is information, a vote on which system works, cast with feet. The East had been losing that vote at the rate of a small city every year. So it did the one thing left. It made leaving a crime, enforced with watchtowers. From this point on, the comparison changes character. The question is no longer just which Germany produces more. It is that one Germany now has to physically prevent its citizens from choosing the other one. An economy that must wall its workers in has already published its result. So how did the plan actually work? Day to day? A central office set targets for the whole economy, tons of steel, meters of cloth, numbers of shoes, cascading down to every factory. Prices were fixed by decree, some unchanged for decades. Rent, bread, the tram, frozen, subsidized, political. And crucially, there was no bankruptcy. A factory that lost money every single year was not closed. Its losses were covered, its targets adjusted, its manager perhaps reassigned. At first, that can sound humane. Sometimes it even was. But removing bankruptcy also removed the economy's stop sign. In a market, a loss is a message, stop. This arrangement wastes more than it creates. The plan silenced that message everywhere, permanently. Capital flowed to what the plan valued, not to what worked. Machines aged, buildings crumbled. East German towns became museums of 1913, minus the maintenance. The economy wasn't lazy, it was deaf. Forget GDP for a minute. Put one household on the ledger. It wants a car. The people's car was the Trabant, a small two-stroke sedan with a body of resin-bonded fiber. To get one, you placed an order and waited. The reported waiting times ran 10 to 16 years. Order the day your child is born, and you might hand them the keys around their 16th birthday. In its final year, reported demand ran at more than 40 orders for every car actually built. And the price, when your turn came, equaled roughly 15 months of an average wage for a design that had barely changed since the 1960s. These figures come from reported records of the period, so treat the digits as approximate. The shape, though, is not in dispute. In the West, the Q was at the bank for a loan. In the East, the Q was the economy. The car was not the exception. It was the pattern. By 1989, roughly 1 in 10 East German households had a telephone, against nearly all of them in the West. The backlog of telephone applications had reportedly passed 1 million, with waits that could stretch past a decade. None of this was because East Germans could not build telephones. This was the country of precision optics and fine machine tools. It was because the plan allocated copper, switchboards, and labor to what it prized. Heavy industry exports for hard currency, and the household got what remained. Scarcity was not a market failure here. It was the plan working as designed, and every Q taught a generation the same quiet lesson. Your time is the one price the state never has to pay. On paper, none of this was happening. Official statistics presented East Germany as one of the world's top 10 industrial economies, and Western agencies took the claims half seriously for years. Outside estimates of the East ran notoriously high. The modern reconstructions are colder. By 1989, output per person in the East stood at roughly 55% of the West, and even that flatters the machines, because much of what the East produced could not be sold on world markets at world prices. Quality adjusted, the gap was wider. Hold both numbers for a moment. A territory that began at rough parity with its twin, by one estimate, slightly ahead, now produced barely half as much per person with equipment decades old. That is the compounding arithmetic of 40 years under different rules. And inside the East's own government, a handful of planners knew the truth was worse still. October 30th, 1989. Crowds are already marching in Leipzig, and the GDR's own chief planner, Gerhard Scheurer, hands the Politburo a secret assessment of the economy. It is a bankruptcy filing in all but name. The state has been borrowing Western currency for years to buy imports and calm its citizens. Debt service is eating the country alive. The memo's arithmetic is brutal. Merely stopping new debt would require cutting living standards by 25 to 30%, a cut the planners judge politically impossible. And this was not a Western critic talking. It was the state's own chief planner. The country could no longer afford its citizens. 10 days later, on November 9th, a bungled press conference opens the wall, and the world watches people dance on the concrete. But the memo tells you what the cameras could not. The system did not fall because a border opened. The border opened because the system was broke. The champagne is real. So is what comes next. 1990. Reunification at speed. And the first great decision is monetary. On July 1st, the Ostmark is replaced by the Deutsche Mark, with wages and prices converted 1-to-1. Politically, it was almost unavoidable. Easterners had waited a lifetime for hard money, and Bonn wanted no second-class citizens. Economically, the Bundesbank's own president warned against it. Here's why. Eastern productivity was perhaps a third of Western levels. Convert wages 1-to-1, and every Eastern factory wakes up paying near Western wages on Eastern output. Overnight, products that had survived inside Comcon were priced out of every market they had, including their own. Reunification did not gently expose the East to competition. It detonated the transition in a single day. The page is turned, the experiment is over, and the bill for it is just arriving. The East's factories had finally reached the market. The harder question: who would own what survived? Germany's answer was the Treuhandanstalt, a trust agency handed roughly 8,500 enterprises and some 4 million workers. Its mandate: privatize, restructure, or close. Then the closures hit hard. Industrial employment collapsed as firm after firm proved unsellable at Western wages. Of the roughly 4 million jobs the agency inherited, reported figures suggest only around 1.5 million remained in those firms by the end. And note who did the buying. By reported counts, roughly 85% of the privatized businesses went to Western owners, about 5% to Easterners. The people who had worked under the plan had no capital to bid with. The factories stayed east. The headquarters, the profits, and the decisions moved west. That asymmetry still shapes the German map. Then came the transfers. Pensions aligned, infrastructure rebuilt, wages topped up, autobahns and rail laid across the east. Researchers who have added up the flows from west to east put the total, over the first 25 years, at roughly 2 trillion euros. An estimate and definitions vary, but every serious count lands in the trillions. From 1991, a solidarity surcharge appeared on Western payslips to help fund it. Designed as temporary, it lasted a generation. The Berlin Wall fell in a night. The economic wall did not. Concrete can be demolished with hand tools and enthusiasm. A 40-year gap in capital, machinery, management, and market relationships has to be filled in. Euro by euro, year by year, and even 2 trillion of them only closes part of it. The wall was gone, the drain was not. On reported net figures, well over 1 million people moved west in the 15 years after unity, once more disproportionately the young and the qualified. Whole towns shrank, schools closed, the average age climbed, which compounds everything else. Fewer young workers means fewer startups, thinner tax rolls, and less reason for a firm to site its next plant there. Demography became the quiet successor to the wall. Nothing forbids returning east, but each departure makes the next one slightly more likely. The pattern has softened in recent years. Some eastern cities now grow again, but the lost cohort does not come back. If you want one reason the catch-up slowed after its fast first decade, start here. The transition cost the East not only its factories, but a share of the generation that would have rebuilt them. So where did all that money land? In real convergence, but not full convergence. In the chaos of 1991, Eastern output per person stood, by various estimates, at somewhere between 1/3 and 43% of the Western level. The 90s closed much of that fast. Then the closing slowed. By 2023, GDP per person in the Eastern states stood at roughly 2/3 of the Western level. Wages sit below Western wages, household wealth further below, and the corporate headquarters, the research budgets, and the highest salaries still cluster overwhelmingly in the West. 2/3 from 1/3 in a single generation that is genuinely one of history's larger catch-ups. And yet, more than 3 decades after the flags changed, you can still find the old border on an economic map of Germany without any political markings at all. The line is fainter. It is not gone. So read the ledger back, not as a list, but as one compounding mechanism. The East started with the war on its back. Then prices, trade, ownership, and exit kept pulling the halves apart, each cause feeding the next. This was never a laboratory. The halves differed in ways no one controlled, and honest historians argue about every baseline. But as a comparison, it is as close as modern history gets. And then 1990 creates a problem for the neat story. If rules made the gap, changing the rules should have erased it. It didn't, because economies are not rulebooks. They are accumulations of capital, of firms, of skills, of where people happen to live. Starting damage mattered. Rules compounded it. History made it sticky. Institutions can change in a night. What they built and failed to build stays on the books for generations. One country ran the experiment twice. The ledger still shows it.